getting into what this is about tonight, I want to just start by kind of, saying that I really think that lawns suck. And frankly, they do this because, they actually literally suck money, time, and resources that could otherwise be spent towards so many other great things like building habitat and making safe and enjoyable places for us to live, as well as the creatures around us. So, lawns with, the more pristine, especially cared for lawn, tolerates incessant mowing. It requires inputs of fertilizers to stay nice and green, pesticides and herbicides to keep pests out and to keep the broadleafed plants out of the lawn. And not to mention, it's one of the most irrigated crops in the US without an actual product to think about, other than something to look at most of the time. We don't really utilize the lawns that we have in our commercial areas, in our parks, in our backyards, our front yards. So there's so many things that we could do with this lawn that currently exists. And we can start by what Doug Tallamy recommends, is to at least think about shrinking our lawns maybe in half. But you can start in small increments and each year shrink it a little bit more and a little bit more. Lawn is useful in some ways. Its main use is to be a functional kind of place for people to walk around, to have gathering spaces. You can kind of think of lawn as being like the outdoor rooms and the connectors of those outdoor rooms to convey you across the landscape. But all the other negative space can be filled in with and framed by either a nice mown edge that's kind of bound by native vegetation, and that could be native perennials, trees and shrubs, and a good sense of all the different layers in the landscape, not just necessarily meadows, but meadows can be incorporated there too. And, the pathways that you can walk through the landscape in don't have to be very narrow like this one shown here. It can be widened a little bit, especially, 3 to 4 feet is good if you're concerned about coming into contact with ticks on a regular basis. And you don't have to necessarily make that material that creates these pathways and outdoor rooms. It doesn't have to be just lawn. It can be other materials too. So you can have kind of these outdoor rooms created by brick. You can make like a kind of a courtyard effect. And the basis of what frames all of this can be native plants, or you can think about using native plant beds and then framing them with something like a brick edge, a wood edge, or a mowed edge, so that you have that cue to care. So your spaces don't necessarily have to look just kind of wild and unkempt, but they can look cared for as well, while still hosting lots of different wildlife. So I suggest to do as much as you can to kind of stack, pack, and layer the native plants that you do incorporate into your gardens and yards. And, include things like native vines that might trellis up an arbor, like the coral honeysuckle in the top left of this photo, or native goldenrods and asters, which there's actually a number of species that are very garden friendly, and I'll talk about a few of those today. Also shrubs like bush honeysuckle and aromatic sumac. There's low growing and taller bushes that can fill out a variety of different types of spaces and even create kind of dividers or screening, buffering from the neighbors or from a road. So all the different functions that native plants have can be utilized even more than they truly are right now in a lot of our landscapes. And this is just a really beautiful fall scene with comb flowers and asters and goldenrods, like I mentioned. And to get that started, my favorite method is to do something called sheet mulching. And I think it's probably the most low impact, easiest method, especially if you have flat ground. If you have a lawn that you want to convert into other types of wildlife habitat and native plantings, you can put down a nice thick layer of overlapping cardboard. You want to make sure that the cardboard overlaps enough so that there's no space for the light to penetrate, and that this is going to be the start of a barrier that basically smothers the lawn weeds below. Before that, you do want to mow the grass pretty low, just so that everything lays nice and flat. And I like to, go to my local grocery store or co-op, or use my Amazon boxes and make sure I take the tape off of them, the staples, anything that's not a natural material. And I wouldn't use the kind of glossy cardboard. I'd stick with the matte food grade cardboard, just so that it can break down and not contribute any chemicals into the soil. Then on top of that, you can add a variety of different things. I'd say at least 2 to 4 inches of something like an aged bark mulch or composted leaves. I'd say if it's composted leaves, you might want to go a little thicker because they break down pretty quickly. Some people do add other things like organic compost or a topsoil mix. And I think those would be better for very specific types of projects where you are trying to kind of rebuild that soil back up and you have very poor soil below. But really, actually, you can find native plants that are going to work with almost any condition that you have. So you don't necessarily need to add, tons of compost to the soil, or start fresh with new topsoil, because as this, mulched layer breaks down over the course of several months, it feeds the soil with more organic matter, and that whole mixture of the sheet mulch actually, smothers the weeds below. And you want to leave this there for at least 3 months. Some people leave it for a whole year, but I like to say, if you put it down in the spring, you can pretty much be ready to plant by fall. It should be mostly broken down by then. And if you put it down in the fall, you can plant into it pretty much in the following spring. So this was actually a project at Nasami Farm in Whately, Massachusetts, which is part of Native Plant Trust. I actually used to work as a horticulturist for Native Plant Trust at their botanical garden in Framingham, Massachusetts. And Nasami Farm is on the other side of Massachusetts. That's where they grow native plugs, all from seed. And so actually an intern that was working at Nasami Farm one year while I was working at Native Plant Trust decided to do an intern project where she would reclaim one of these parking lot islands that had been just abandoned lawn and maybe just mowed several times a season. That wasn't really contributing much, but it had a few nice trees in the middle of it, like a pin oak in the background and then a red oak on the other side that you can't see. And so she did this sheet mulching method. Her name's Shannon Dry, and in the spring, and then planted into it in the fall with a nice patchwork of native lawn alternatives. And they used native plugs that they grew on site, actually, in their greenhouses in the back. And plugs are really great to work with when you're planting across a large area because they come in flats of, 50 to 72, 32. It's a variety of different sizes, but generally they have really well-developed root systems, but they're smaller plants and a little bit cheaper per each plant. So you can really kind of mass something with a batch of 50 plugs. And so she planted things like Pennsylvania sedge and Appalachian sedge, and a variety of other things that I'll list here, actually. This is after it's been grown in for a couple of years. So you can see that things were planted before at about like 6 to 12 inches apart, pretty close together, and they filled in really quickly, depending on the species. But part of the point of her intern project was to try out different lawn alternatives for this really compacted parking lot, and mostly in full sun, except for under the shade of this pin oak. So we have the pin oak here casting a fair amount of shade, especially at certain times of day. So underneath the pin oak, where there was the most shade, they planted the foam flower, and that's actually a woodland wildflower that creates a nice ground cover. It blooms in spring with these gorgeous kind of frothy flowers. Wavy hairgrass, which is also, it's actually a grass that's very shade tolerant. And it's a native bunching grass. It has really beautiful seed heads that are very ethereal and a dark green foliage. And then Appalachian sedge, which is this more light green chartreuse sedge. Sedges are a lot like grasses. They're kind of in the same larger group, botanically speaking, but they're just botanically speaking, a slightly different type of plant. And they have a lot of great application for the landscape because they knit together nicely a lot of times, like grasses, and kind of can create kind of lawn alternatives. So Appalachian sedge is one that can handle a lot of drought and a little bit more sun. And then three-tooth cinquefoil is a native ground cover that I'll talk a little bit more about later. This is a glossy leaved ground cover and is really tough. It's an alpine plant that they placed it actually at the edge of this planting so that the outer edge would get kind of beat up the most, and this plant can handle a lot of that. As long as it doesn't have competition from taller weeds above, I think it can do really well. On the other side, from another vantage point, you can see that there's this red oak. And just to also reiterate, if you weren't here for Doug Tallamy's talk, it's really important to think about planting oak species and lots of other native tree species when you can, not just necessarily the ground layer. Because a lot of the native trees, the oaks, the willows, the cherries, birches, and poplars, those are kind of our top 5, and maple kind of makes it into the top 6 or so. All of those species host hundreds and hundreds of caterpillars, which are basically the larval stages of moths and butterflies. So having a pollinator garden isn't just about having showy flowers, but it's having those host plants for the caterpillars that will really need their leaves when they're young. And in turn, baby songbirds are actually fed on a diet mostly of protein-rich caterpillars. They're kind of the perfect protein little sausage to fit in a baby bird's mouth. So some of the other species planted underneath were autumn bentgrass, which is a warm season bunching native grass. Has a beautiful kind of feathery texture. And then pussy toes, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. That's that kind of more gray foliage. That's a real ground hugger. Also very drought tolerant and a great larval host plant too. Purple lovegrass is similar in kind of texture to the autumn bentgrass, but has a purple kind of haze. Oftentimes you'll see this in highway margins. And then in the background, you can see the Sami farm has native plantings all around its building, and wants to kind of demonstrate what can be done with native plants. So a river birch and another one of those kind of keystone species that will host tons and tons of different caterpillars. A sedge lawn is, this is Pennsylvania sedge, another different type of sedge, which was also planted in that Nasami Farm project. But sedge lawn is a real kind of new lawn alternative for native plants that people are starting to use more and more. And that's mainly because with Pennsylvania sedge, this is a particular sedge that doesn't get very tall. Once it's established, it's very, very drought tolerant. And you don't really need to mow it, hardly ever, if at all. You can mow it maybe once a year, I think maybe in the spring, early spring, before these little poofy yellow flowers come out to kind of give the flowers a nice clean, canvas to bloom from. But you don't have to do that even. And it can handle kind of moderate foot traffic. It's definitely not a soccer turf. It's not a turf alternative. And it's really hard to find a native plant that really takes the place of a turf alternative. There are lots of native plants that make great ground covers that blend well into lawns, and some that you can handle a little foot traffic. But overall, I think it's probably best, if you want a true turf, to get some sort of eco lawn mix. And you can get something like that, but from seed, from places like Prairie Nursery, Prairie Moon Nursery. They're usually composed of a number of different fescue species, which is a type of grass, they tend to be very drought tolerant and don't grow too fast, so you don't have to mow them as frequently. So look for those kinds of things. And, even if it's not native, it doesn't mean that, it's doing harm necessarily. And I'll get into a little bit of that more. But Pennsylvania sedge makes a really nice lawn alternative. And it's also, you could call it also a pollinator plant without having, animal pollinated flowers. Its flowers are wind pollinated, but its leaves host a lot of different caterpillar species too. So this is another way to host wildlife. And I found baby deer does bedding down in Pennsylvania sedge lawn. And so a lot of wildlife find it as a really important cover as well. So who wouldn't want an edible ground cover, I like to say. Wild strawberries are probably one of my absolute favorite native plants because they are really a workhorse of the garden. They spread vigorously, which isn't always a bad thing. It's important to know what plants do spread vigorously so that you can use them in the right situations. But wild strawberry, I would want to spread vigorously because it produces lots of edible fruits, and its early spring flowers are, attractive to a lot of different bee species too. And then it also provides a larval host plant to a number of different caterpillar species. So, it can make kind of a soft, slightly higher lawn to walk in if it's planted on its own. But it also can be incorporated into a lawn type situation. And when mowed regularly, it will actually be a lot more tame and play better with others. So I want to kind of move into thinking about how do we, I've talked a little bit about all the ways that you can shrink your lawn, add more native layers, the trees, the shrubs, the ground covers into your spaces as an alternative. But what do you do with the rest of the area that exists as lawn? You can, let it diversify a little bit more. It doesn't have to be just, one monoculture crop. So I think it would be fun to kind of do an exercise and think about what can we incorporate into our lawns and how can we encourage more diversity in our lawns that's still beautiful and pleasing and much nicer to walk on than kind of a chemically treated lawn. So the first thing to do is to, just stop mowing your lawn too many times over the summer. You could mow it, a couple times over the summer. I also like to kind of recommend, if you're not ready to kind of go all in with this, try like a 10 by 10 square patch or circular, it doesn't matter what shape it is, of your lawn to experiment with, and mow everything else around it for the season. So you can just kind of observe what comes up and what happens as you let things grow. There will be lots of different flowers that grow. Sometimes you'll just get the Kentucky bluegrass, which is the usual lawn species that's everywhere in our lawns. And that will just get big and flower. But you could also get a number of different wildflower species, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, make your field guides and your identification apps and online resources your friend. Yeah, so I think I'll start back with creating a 10 by 10 patch, a small patch that you can kind of experiment with. Stop mowing just a small patch of your lawn, maybe mow everything else that you would normally mow just for the first season to see what happens. And you can let all of those weeds come up, flowers come up, and let things flower. And when they flower, that's when the best time is to identify them. So I like to use Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, Wildflowers of New England by Ted Elliman. iNaturalist is like my go-to phone app because you can upload a photo of a plant and get some ideas about what a plant might be, and then have it verified by other professionals on the app. And you can also contribute to citizen science that way. All of the plants are geolocated. So it's a really powerful tool. And then I use Go Botany, which is a native plant trust online tool. It's kind of best on the computer, not as great on the phone, but I use that almost daily, or like multiple times a day, to look up plants that are naturalized in New England or native to New England. So once you have identified some of those wildflowers, in that flowering stage, if they're a plant that you kind of deem that might be a little bit, weedy, or something that you just don't really want in your yard, maybe it's a non-native plant, first try just cutting off the flowers of those unwanted plants. Just don't let them go to seed. Don't let them reproduce. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions, like a lot of native plants like clovers will actually do fine with repeated cutting and will, probably be invigorated by that because they spread vegetatively. But that's another story. We'll get into that later. And then the desired plants, if you do find that there's something cool like a wild strawberry or some other native plant in your lawn, then you let them flower and give them the competitive advantage by letting them go to seed and reproducing themselves. Then kind of the last step is adding valuable native species to your lawn. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the following slides. So this is one kind of example of what can happen if you stop mowing your lawn. It's going to be different for everyone because it really depends on what's around you, what's the vegetation around you, are there invasive species nearby? I'm really glad that the next speaker is going to talk about invasive species, so I won't get too much into that right now. But are there weedy species nearby? Are there agricultural fields? Are you near a highway or roadsides that have a lot of weedy species? If not, then you could potentially have the chance to have some native species come up, like asters and goldenrods, those more vigorous kind of weedy native species, and maybe even some coneflowers, but you probably won't have a lot of native species come up. So in terms of letting your lawn go to meadow, this is a really fun thing to try, but it's not necessarily something that I think I'd recommend for the beginner or for every single person. I'd recommend, if you really want to establish a native planting with layers of trees and shrubs and perennials, then to maybe start with the cardboard method, the sheet mulching method. But this is one example of what can happen, especially if you're every now and then overseeding with some native species like black-eyed coneflowers and asters and goldenrods, those species that are going to be able to take hold even with all the competition of the European grasses and weeds. So some of the common lawn weeds that will come up in your lawn could be things like that are native and great lawn weeds, like wild strawberry, bluets. If you're really lucky, you have bluets in your lawn, that would be my dream. Common cinquefoil. Some violets are native, but most of the violets that would come up in your lawn are probably European weeds, but are still great pollinator plants, so they're not really harmful. A lot of the species that would come up in your lawn are probably European weeds that are kind of innocuous. And so there's a good long list of those. And this list is not comprehensive. This is just, some of the most common weeds. But clovers and yellow wood sorrel, that little plant that looks like a clover and tastes like a kind of lemony, that's wood sorrel. That's a really common weed that's not native. Dandelion, even though dandelion's ubiquitous, it's not really a threat to our native ecosystems. So a few dandelions that come up in your lawn are not really going to do any harm, though I know that a lot of people find them pesty. Plantain, chickweed, crabgrass, etc. Now, the ones that you really want to keep an eye on are things like ajuga. This is bugleweed. It's oftentimes an escaped garden plant that has kind of run into wild spaces, been planted intentionally as a ground cover because it does create a really, rapid spreading ground cover, but it's a non-native plant that is kind of invading other wild habitats. And I'd say vinca, which is not on this list, is another one of those species. Gill over the ground and bird's foot trefoil, more weeds that could be a little bit more on the aggressive side. But, you know, I also would say that the group of non-native but more aggressive weeds, if you have a large pasture area, I wouldn't really spend your time going after these because it's just not worth it. They're going to probably be there anyway. So I would really spend your time, especially if you have a large area, going after the noxious or weeds or invasive species. So something like sheep sorrel, that's pretty much in almost every pasture lawn that I walk by. And it's related to the yellow wood sorrel, but it has kind of like a different type of leaf. It has like a spade-like leaf with two little ears at the base of the leaf. And it also tastes like lemon. Creeping thistle, I don't think people generally like thistles in their lawn anyway, but there is a thistle that is very invasive. It has a shiny glossy leaf and it spreads by runners, and that's a really tough one to get rid of. And something like creeping bellflower, I know that that's all over Portland and other parts of Maine. And I've seen it in New Hampshire in the White Mountains even. So that's actually a pretty noxious weed that I would definitely try to eliminate if possible by maybe smothering with thick black plastic for a good couple years. So if you have those non-native and noxious invasive plants that you find in your yard, you do want to kind of get rid of those before you really do anything else. And you can visit your state government website should usually have a lot of resources on that. You can find the invasive weeds that have been banned for sale in your state, as well as ones to look out for. So, but I really want to kind of bring home the message that weeds are in the eye of the beholder. So a lot of plants that we kind of think of as weeds are also, you know, really important wildlife plants, and maybe they spread throughout a lawn, but they're not really going to cause harm. So Heolol or Prunella vulgaris, this is kind of like a violet where there's some native and non-native subspecies. In the end, if it's already growing in my lawn, I don't really care whether it's the native or non-native one. I just care that it provides, you know, nectar and pollen for different pollinators. And then it's also a food source for a lot of caterpillars. And it covers the ground, which is really important to, you know, cover the ground and protect it from erosion and keep the moisture retained. Ground covers are great for that. Also, there might be some species that you find, you know, pollinating your lawn, like the black swallowtail butterfly. Even if your lawn is covered in non-native plants like red clover. Red clover is a great, you know, nectar plant, and it might not be something that hosts as many different species as a native wildflower, but it will provide some kind of pollination services as well. So, but, you know, you have to remember that when you have a flowering plant that attracts a butterfly, you need to also have a host plant for that caterpillar to grow on. So sometimes it's a non-native plant like you know, your garden fennel or a carrot, because the black swallowtails are really attracted to carrot family plants. But there are native species of carrot family plants that also attract black swallowtails, things like Zizia, which are some of the golden Alexanders, heartleaf golden Alexanders, and regular golden Alexanders, as well as Angelica, which grows in wetlands. And when I'm thinking about what to incorporate into my lawn, I like to kind of draw inspiration from analogous kind of situations. Like the cemetery, surprisingly, is a place where you find some really interesting native plants, because cemeteries are usually sited where it's very well-draining soils. And that actually is very similar to maybe the leach field in your backyard, which is purposely a well-draining soil matrix for good reason. The main thing that if you're planting over something like a leach field is you just don't want to have deep tap-rooted plants. You don't want to have big trees. Some shrubs you can even plant as long as they're shallow-rooted shrubs, but mostly some grasses like little blue stem and ground covers should not be a problem. But, you find non-native species like white clover and pollinators like bumblebees on them, as well as little bluestem grass, which grows also in highway margins. It's a very drought tolerant plant that handles very kind of poor, thin soils. And I just love this for really tough situations in the garden where not much else will grow.